Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Declaring that India prioritizes to deepen ties with African nations, Vice President M. Venkaiah Naidu, accompanied by a high-level delegation, kick-started his tour to Comoros and Sierra Leone last week. Mr. Naidu asserted that 32 outgoing visits of the President, the Prime Minister and the Vice President in the past 5 years and India's decision to open 18 new embassies in Africa are evident of the fact that Africa is considered as a focus continent by the Indian government. In his first engagement in Comoros, the Vice President addressed the Indian diaspora and urged them to join in writing New India's growth story with 3 other Ds: democracy, demand and demographic dividend. Meanwhile, India and Sierra Leone signed 6 agreements on Sunday to expand the bilateral relations in various fields and also agreed to push for UNSC reforms so that 1/3 of mankind residing in Africa and India occupy their rightful place in decision-making bodies of the UN. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze India's engagement with the African continent. Joining me on the program today are Anil Trigunayath, former ambassador, KP Nair, strategic analyst, and Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. How would you look at the visit of the Vice President to both these African countries and of what importance is it?
Well, the good thing is that this Vice President has been going to Africa and several visits he's undertaken. And this is in accordance with the government's policy of deeply engaging with Africa, which has been, at least the high-level interaction has been missing from our side for decades. And now in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen more than 38, 37 visits at the level of President, Vice President and Prime Minister happening to the region, and which is extremely important. And as we know, the Africa is one of the most important regions for the world, and in my view, in the second half of this century, you will see an Afro-Asian century emerging. Not only Asian century, but merging into the African. And that is the place where the real action is going to be. And therefore, it is extremely important. And it is in this context that I see the Vice President's visit to Comoros and Sierra Leone. There were never any visit to Comoros Island. It is the first ever visit at a high level by any Indian dignitaries. And the kind of agreements that we have signed with them. It's a poor country, a small country with a small trade possibilities, but it's a very strategic location in the Indian Ocean. It used to fall on the trade routes at one time. It was very strong. It has a tremendous flora and fauna. But at the same time, the 3 islands that comprise Comoros now, but the 4th one which is still continuing to be with the French, they are very, very strategic from our point of view, and that is the reason that I think, apart from other MOUs on foreign office consultations, CEP and all that, we have signed a defense cooperation MOU with them, agreement, and under which we are also going to supply them a couple of high-speed boats. We are giving them some more money to buy about 10 high-speed boats. So defense and in the Indian Ocean region, and IORA India is paying their contribution actually. So that is a strategic point of, in my view, of this Comoros visit, very, very significant. As far as Sierra Leone is concerned, we have been involved with them in stabilizing the country. Our forces were there under the aegis of the United Nations on ASMIL, and we have been stationing about 40,000 odd forces were there, and we have done remarkably well. Again, this was the area where we had not done much, and both are the Francophone countries. And this why we need to, now in my view, I also look at it from another point of view, is that the French, who still hold a very close relationship with these countries, and India and France are now coming closer, and therefore there is a greater possibility of entering into that strategic domain with these countries. So I believe that there is a new beginning of our relationship with these countries, and most of the African countries until 3 years ago have been always complaining that there are no high-level visits from India. People used to go to South Africa and that's it. Right. And that has changed, and that is remarkable in that context. Only thing is, whatever lines of credits we announce, whatever aid we announce, like in this case we are giving to both of them 1,000 metric tons of rice and all, this should be delivered immediately. Right. The delivery mechanisms should improve very quickly.
Sure.
That's very important.
Sure. I'm going to take the point that the ambassador made about South Africa forward with you, Mr. Nair. When we look at the African continent as a whole, historically, the ties have been, focused around South Africa, be it BRICS or be it any of the multilateral forums where India and South Africa have come together. But over the last 5 or 6 years, you've noticed that we started engaging with smaller countries as well. How important is that?
I'm glad you asked this question because this has been a problem. Either we go to East Africa, where there is a large concentration of Indian origin people, or South Africa because of the traditional links that we've had even during the apartheid years with the African National Congress and the Indian community, Gandhiji's presence there and all that. I'm glad. I said I'm glad because one thing that has not been noted amidst all the visits that are taking place is that very quietly but hopefully very effectively, the Narendra Modi government has launched an Atlantic African initiative. You see, like the President Ramnath Kovind made 10 visits to Africa in his tenure. 4 of these have been to countries on the Atlantic coast of Africa. You see, we've traditionally concentrated on the other side and generally neglected the Atlantic coast. The Vice President also has been concentrating on countries that we have not paid attention to. You see, the problem is that our Indo-Pacific initiative gets a lot of attention because countries in the Pacific are better known, they have a better image, but intrinsically I think the Atlantic African initiative of the government deserves a lot of praise because these are countries which are in some ways difficult to deal with in the sense of functioning there or setting up things there and all that. But these are also countries which have tremendous resources that have been less exploited than African countries in the rest of the continent. So it is a very good initiative that this government has undertaken in concentrating on countries other than the better known ones like South Africa, as you mentioned.
Kenya, Zimbabwe.
Yes, and the Vice President's current visit, ongoing visit, for instance, Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is so rich in resources. Sierra Leone, there have been controversies about diamonds and all that. But we need to put our best foot forward. And Comoros, again, it has been neglected in Indian diplomacy. So this, I would say, is an initiative that can bring rich returns if, as I always say on your programs, if there is follow-up. Our main problem is follow-up, and I hope these visits will be followed up, high-level visits will be followed up by concrete action on the ground.
Right. So, Professor Pant, as is being pointed out by both the panelists, of course, we need follow-up and we also need timely delivery as far as, engaging with nations in Africa or anywhere else in the world is concerned. We'll put that aside and we'll talk about the strategic importance of Comoros now, because let's not forget this government has focused a lot on the Indian Ocean as well. And since it's an island nation close to Somalia where piracy and all of that happens as well, how important is it to have strategic ties with nations like Comoros and others in the region?
Well, I think it's very important, and I think when Prime Minister laid out his Indo-Pacific vision at the Shangri-La, and when he talked of the expanse that India's Indo-Pacific vision covers, the Indian Ocean and the littoral assumes an importance that I think it deserves in India's strategic mapping. And so you have these small island states which we are now beginning to take relatively more seriously than in the past, and I think that's a good sign in terms of whether we want to expand our footprint in that part of the world, whether we look at Indian Ocean as a very important strategic component of our larger Indo-Pacific strategy, or whether we look at the great power geopolitical contestation that is going on and how effectively other countries, some of the other major powers, in particular China, has been successful in bringing some of the smaller nations into their scheme of things. So I think if you look at Comoros, if you look at how it has been relatively neglected in the Indian scheme of things, perhaps it's all very well now that we are beginning to look at its role in the larger framework of our Indian Ocean strategy and in the larger framework of our Indo-Pacific strategy. So clearly you have these smaller island states, and we have traditionally focused on countries like Mauritius and Madagascar, which are where we have Indian diaspora, for example. And it's only now that we are beginning to see a more strategic context to these engagements, and therefore having a solid partner in many of these countries would give India the kind of footprint in the region that perhaps it wants. And therefore it seems to me that this can become a very important instrument in the way we shape going forward our larger maritime strategy in that part of the world. And of course it then dovetails very well and with the larger African strategy that India has evolved. And I think a point that has been made earlier is that one of the complaints that you always used to hear is that India's engagement is episodic in nature. It comes and then it goes. And now that we have had sustained interaction, or at least there is a policy of having sustained interaction at high levels, it not only sends a signal to Africa, to the larger littoral states, that we continue to be involved, but also I think it does some good to your credibility as an actor, that as you're rising, as you claim that you have geopolitical interests in various parts of the world, you need to be engaged at the very high level. And that's what I think Vice President visits and the previous visits, which have been very frequent now, underscore.